This was, you were coming down. And then suddenly there was this sense of the visual field splitting and something lying behind it.
It drew apart like a curtain.
I never had exactly that. I remember I had a very anomalous DMT trip once. It was sort of like that. Here's what it was. It was really a strange one. I can't remember where I was, but anyway, I smoked the DMT and I expected to see the chrysanthemum and everything as I described. And instead, when I opened my eyes, not when I opened my eyes, but when I broke through into the space, I seemed to see red flocked wallpaper in a fleur-de-lis on a wall of some sort. It looked like red flocked wallpaper. And as I looked at this, I dropped my head forward, and there was a water fountain spigot of the kind that you depress and it shoots a stream of water coming out of a marble basin. And it was just perfectly realistic. And then above it, and then I saw above it, was this flocked red wallpaper. And as I was trying to get my bearings in this situation, I turned like 90 degrees, and there was a curtain of red velvet. And I walked through the curtain, and there was a DMT trip up on a huge cinemascope screen. And I just sat down in the aisle seat, and then the trip happened. But there had been this peculiar hesitation where I was apparently in some Art Deco movie palace somewhere on the foyer landing at the water fountain, and I never quite understood what that was about or why it happened, but it had the same quality of the parting curtain revealing the trip somehow already in progress. One of the things that goes on in DMT that's sort of odd is you perceive your body geometry differently. You seem to have an infantile body. You can tell that your head is massive and your body is small and your arms and legs are short. And at times we've played around with the idea that once you smoke DMT, all subsequent trips are like journeys back to this first trip. It's as though you open a nexus in time in your personality, and then every subsequent trip you just return to this open place. There's a very funny feeling about it that is something about the past, something about time. It's hard to put your finger on. The notion of talking with self-transforming machine elves, which is how I put it in my book, The Invisible Landscape, I couldn't believe it when I wrote these words on paper. It seemed like such a freaky notion. But people say, yes, that's it. I know what you're talking about. I saw that same thing too. Well, that seems to me to mean that self-transforming machine elves is actually a step forward in language, and that the psychedelic issue is somehow linked to the evolution of language, and that we are not, and in fact the whole culture crisis generally is linked to a direct evolution of language. We have to change the way we speak about reality, and then it will be perceived as different. And this apparently cannot be done by great leaps. It's done incrementally by introducing a concept here, a word there, a notion somewhere else. But the psychedelicization, if you will, of society and language seems to me was never blunted and goes on apace and has ever since Leary and Metzner and all those giants back in the Stone Age dumped LSD on American society. I see it everywhere, in design, in music, in fashion, everywhere that doesn't count, someone said to me. It's everywhere but in the control mechanism. But I think the control mechanism is probably the last to get the news, that culture is shedding its skin faster than anyone can anticipate. So this evolution of language thing really interests me. And recently when people have been saying, what do you want to do with it? Where do you want to take it? I'm less interested than I used to be in extraterrestrials, flying saucers, all of that stuff. I still access it regularly. But you see, when I first started publicly speaking, I thought that if people confirmed what I was saying, the obligation would somehow leave me to do anything about it, and it would be like NASA would take care of it or something like that. But I've discovered that, as my friend Eric Jonch used to tell me, that society really is metastable. That, I'm perfectly free to say these outlandish things, and you're perfectly free to believe them and to say them to your friends, and it doesn't matter a bit, apparently. So, or the effect is so long-term that it doesn't matter a bit. So I've turned from the question of indicating the presence of the other to the question of what is it like to be the person who indicates the presence of the other. And so I'm more interested in the transformation of the quality of daily experience when we are unstoned, or at least unstoned enough.
I tend to do glossolalias, which are more conversational. And I like them because they play with meaning. So that kind of stuff sort of sounds like ethnobotanist. Yeah, I do this alone in the dark. And what it is it places an edge for the light to follow, and you discover meaning in the absence of context, and you discover like the source of meaning before it is contextually located. Don't ask me what these kinds of words mean. This is how I learned to talk, hanging out with these semiotics people. But it's something like that, And I think people did this for hundreds of thousands of years for each other as a form of performance art, long before somebody got the nuts and bolts notion that you could connect an action in the world or a linguistic intent to a sound. That we're just set up for this, these small mouth noises.
If DMT didn't exist, we would have to invent it. There has to be something in the world. There has to be a weirdest thing. Once we have the concept weird, there has to be a weirdest thing. And DMT is simply it. DMT is that thing which, above all other things, you have convinced yourself doesn't exist. It's the one thing you are certain is impossible. That's how it seemed to me. It completely deconstructs reality in a completely unexpected way. In other words, reality can come apart many different ways, and if it begins to come apart, you hope it will begin to move along some traditionally sanctioned spiritual arc, toward Jesus or heaven or hell or something identifiable. What happens with DMT is there's an eruption of the unexpected. It seems to be in its nature to be unexpected. And it seems to carry the message with incredible intensity that everything you know about reality is wrong. It isn't what you think it is. When you smoke DMT, when I smoke DMT, and according to Rick Strassman's research out at New Mexico, when most people are exposed to DMT, very quickly, like within 30 seconds to a minute, you are conveyed into an inconceivably alien and dramatic environment of 100% hallucination. nothing you have ever seen before is there. There is nothing there that the English language can describe, because there is nothing there that any English-speaking person ever has encountered before, or German, or French, or Swahili. You are conveyed into not a unitary world, not the white light, the one, or any of that, but a complex, multiplistic world of motion, light, color, depth, interaction, and none of it makes very much sense at all. It's a metaphor for what I'm talking about is, imagine that you were a Paleolithic person getting loaded around a campfire somewhere on the grasslands of Africa, and imagine that for a minute and a half you suddenly found yourself standing in Times Square at rush hour. Well, you could sort of make sense of it. I mean, when you came back, you would say, well, there were people, sort of. There were sort of people, and then there was a lot of motion, and then there was a lot of verticality, but basically you're just thrashing and clawing the air in front of your companions. They are not getting a picture of Times Square at rush hour from this description. DMT is like that. It seems to punch through to an impossible world, a parallel dimension. And it's not as if it would be shocking enough if it were purely incomprehensible. The problem is it's not quite purely incomprehensible. There's a 2% residuum that you seem to be able to relate to. These self-dribbling basketball-like entities that I call types that come bounding up and leap into your body and crawl all over you and jump in and out of your chest cavity. They are singing in some kind of a language that you don't hear but see. And so they're singing objects into existence. Some kind of musical grammar is condensing small pieces of furniture around you. And you have to remember, 30 seconds before you were in some shabby apartment, you and your strange friends, fiddling with some drug, and now that's all gone, and you're not sleepy, you're not dazed, you're absolutely who you were. That's the strange thing. DMT doesn't affect the part that we call ourself. Say, I am who I was, I'm exactly who I was, but what the hell has happened to reality? And it's been entirely replaced by something that I never saw in any science fiction film, never heard about in any fairy tale, never dreamed of, never hinted of, and now I'm fully there. And these little entities are dancing around attention, and then they want you to do something. They want you to sing objects into existence with your voice. And they're doing it. They're showing you how it's done. They somehow, grammar is seen in that world. It's as though a switch has been thrown in your neurophysiological machinery, and language, which you used to hear, you now see. And these things are putting a lot of pressure on you, saying, do it, don't question, don't think, don't reflect, just do it. And I sort of feel something cross between heartburn and satori begin to move its way up my chest, and when it reaches my mouth flies open, and this glossolalia-like linguistic stuff begins to happen, which is like language, like liquid, like silk. I can see it, and it's colored, and it's complicated. And now I do not understand what this is for. I can join you in speculating. It looks to me like, first of all, language itself is a mysterious activity, a behavior. God on the body of nature, human language is the place to look. It is not anticipated in other forms of animal organization, and in us it reaches this excruciating level of expression. And with it, we have created culture, which is a virtual reality that we surround ourselves with, not only of ideologies, Marxism, democracy, monarchy, but buildings, highways, infrastructure. So it's almost as though language is an alien artifact of some sort. You remember Bill Burroughs said it's a virus from outer space. Well, this is sort of like that idea. But language is obviously not something that is a finished enterprise. And I think that we are approaching, either through the natural evolution of the soma, of the body, or through technology, or through some combination of the two, we're approaching a place where we're going to switch channels and switch the language channel into a more broad bandwidth mode, and we're going to see what we mean instead of hear what we mean. That the convention of using small mouth noises to symbolically indicate objects in the world so that those who share the same set of linguistic assumptions can download this acoustical babble and reconstruct a thought out of it is going to be traded in for something more like a direct acoustical hologram, where then ambiguity is much less prevalent. You know, if I read you a paragraph from Proust, we can spend the rest of the afternoon discussing what did the author mean. You've all been in those situations. What did the author mean? But if I show you a sculpture by Brancusi, we just walk around and look at it. It self-evidently is what it is. It does not have the ambiguity that adheres to written and spoken language. And I think this ambiguity has allowed misunderstanding, and misunderstanding has allowed pain and agony. So it may be that we're on the brink of a higher form of language, the descent of the logos. This would be it, the manifestation of the logos, and the psychedelics, by allowing a look through the hyperspatial window at future states of human organization, as I argued this morning, is actually giving us a taste of a human future that may be far in the future. In the same way that if you had smoked DMT 20,000 years ago, you might have landed in Times Square circa 1960. It's an insight into a future development in the physiology and mind of man, and makes it very suggestive then that DMT is being elaborated in our brains as part of normal metabolism. We have genes that produce DMT. Well, what if those genes were to be switched on in a more dramatic way? Then what would the quality of culture be? If culture is the serotonin trip, then what kind of culture would we live in if the serotonin were backed out in favor of a DMT-maintained neural substrate?
Well, I don't know. Is a self-transforming elf machine a deva?
What do you mean?
This is a phrase that has been associated with me for many, many years. I encounter self-transforming elf machines, which are creatures, entities, perhaps, although they're not made out of matter. They're made out of, as nearly as I can figure it out, they're made out of syntax driving light. But if what your question addresses is the issue of entities on the other side, there are definitely entities on the other side for me, and there seem to be such for many, many other people. I'm not by any standard sensitive. So if I get entities, then they are substantial and capable of defending themselves. It's one of the most challenging parts of the whole psychedelic landscape, because most people can accept the idea of disordered sensory input, recovery of traumatic memory material, so forth and so on. But what are we to do with an elf? You know, that becomes a little harder to contextualize in psychoanalytic theory, although Jung did a good job when he said autonomous elements can escape from the psyche's control and present themselves as independent entities. I'm not sure he's ever seen a self-transforming elf machine. Are those Devic entities, do you think?
Yeah, I don't have any hallucinogenic experience. Myself, I'm more familiar with connections in nature and other experiences that people have had with the Finhorn group or being in the Himalayas, that kind of thing. So what you're saying is through your experiences with pharmaceuticals, you have that experience, even if you're not having it when you're not.
Oh, it's the defining characteristic of the true DMT flash. I mean, it is not subtle. It's these things mob you like badly trained Rottweilers. They come bounding forward by the dozens, by the hundreds. They jump into your body. They jump out of your body. And I've thought, I mean, it maps to some degree over the archetype of the little people, the leprechaun, the fae, and being Irish and being Jungian. I'm willing to entertain, maybe I have a special relationship to this stuff. But then in the Amazon, the people using DMT that I studied in the early 70s, the reason they did it, they said, was to speak with the little people. What puzzles me about my contacts with these beings is it conforms to, let's say, the Irish model. They are small, they live under hills, or when you're with them you have a sense that you are somehow underground. They are full of merriment, almost to a manic and frightening level. It's sort of like a Bugs Bunny cartoon gone berserk. They are friendly, but play rough. In other words, it's a land of explosions and falling anvils. It's like a Roadrunner cartoon or something. But the overwhelming feeling is love, but I spell it L-U-V to distinguish it from the ordinary kind, because it's just this kind of crazy, childish affection. And they're delighted to have me in their presence. Well, now that all sort of corresponds with the Irish model or with worldwide folklore of little creatures, little people in the woods. What's happening that is not mappable onto fairyland or leprechauns or Findhornian beings or anything like that, or anything else I've ever heard of, is that these entities have an agenda. And it's a very curious agenda. They use a language which you see. It is made out of sound. In other words, it is sound, but you see it in that state. And the entire point of the encounter from their perspective seems to be to teach you to do this. They want you to transform your language. They want you to speak Elfish. And, what? If you've never done DMT and you just smoked it and you're 30 seconds into this experience and this is what it's come down to, you wonder what to make of it. I've thought about this for years and years and years, and I don't know why there should be an invisible syntactical intelligence giving language lessons in hyperspace, but that certainly consistently seems to be what is happening. I've thought a lot about language as a result of that, and several things about it. First of all, it is the most remarkable thing we do, I think. And we talked a little bit this morning about epigenetic behaviors. Chomsky showed that language, the deep structure of language, is under genetic control. But that's like the assembly language level. Local expressions of language are epigenetic. And it seems to me that language is some kind of enterprise of human beings that is not finished. That we have now left the grunts and the digs of the elbow somewhat in the dust, but the most articulate, brilliantly pronounced and projected English or French or German or Chinese is still a poor carrier of our intent, a very limited bandwidth for the intense compression of data that we are trying to put across to each other. And it occurs to me from studying McLuhan and other people that the ratios of the senses, the ratio between the eye and the ear and so forth, this also is not genetically fixed. There are ear cultures and there are eye cultures, print cultures and electronic cultures. So it may be that our perfection and our completion lies in the perfection and completion of the word. Again, this curious theme of the word and its effort to concretize itself. A language that you can see is far less ambiguous than a language that you hear. If I read a paragraph of Proust, then we could spend the rest of the afternoon discussing what did he mean. But if we look at a piece of sculpture by Henry Moore, we can discuss what did he mean, but at a certain level there is a kind of shared bedrock that isn't in the Proust passage. We each stop at a different level with the textual passage. With the three-dimensional object, we all sort of start from the same place and then work out our interpretations. You know, is it a nude? Is it an animal? Is it bronze? Is it wood? Is it poignant? Is it comical? So forth and so on. So this is not a very scientific part of the rap, because it's very hard to convince people that there are non-human intelligences this side of Genebel Ganubi. And when you tell them that these non-human intelligences are accessed through the diminutive mushrooms growing on their front lawn, they just write you off as a squirrel. But this question of the non-human intelligences is very, very much on the agenda. All shamans in all times and places have claimed this. And the thing that so pleases me about DMT is, a lot of people will not take a psychedelic like LSD or psilocybin or something because it lasts hours and hours. Inevitably, a thing lasting that long, you're going to end up dealing with your stuff, your anxiety, your fear, your this and that. And a lot of people don't care for that sort of thing. Whether that's good or bad is another issue. With DMT, it lasts 4 minutes. And so how lost in an examination of childhood trauma can you get in 4 minutes, especially when you have hundreds of elves tugging at your coat sleeves? So it's really an incredibly powerful tool. We have the UFO people claiming there are non-human intelligences, but they have no reliable method of contact that works for a skeptic. The great thing about DMT is it doesn't require belief, a quality I mentioned last night as belonging to the truth. The truth requires no belief. It is the truth. I'm sure there are probably people listening to my words at this moment who have encountered these entities. This, to my mind, is the great and chilling mystery in the center of the psychedelics. And once you've encountered these things, you have to take them seriously, to the point of you have to understand, where do they fit into the great order of being? What are
these things? How can there be a life form not made of matter? In other words, how can they be intelligent and coherent but have no fixed body outline? Is the universe in fact populated by non-human, non-material intelligences that we somehow contact using drugs? I mean, that's one possibility.
Beyond the DMT experience.
That's the question, yes. Where are they when you're not there? Is it an ongoing thing? Is something going on this planet? Are these the controllers? Are you getting into a back channel that weren't cleared for? Or, and this is to my mind the most chilling and appalling and exhilarating possibility of all, when you go back over the shamanism thing, you say, you shamans, now where is this all coming from? They will tell you it comes from ancestors. Well, that's a cheerful and fairly sanitized concept, but when you deconstruct it, ancestors are dead people. What is actually being suggested there is that there is a kind of ecology of souls, one energy threshold over, that is co-present with this world. Well, strangely enough, that's what the Irish myth of the Fae says. It says these are dead people. These are souls that linger in our environment, and this is what souls look like. Again, folklore is only a guide, but if what we are dabbling with, if what lies at the end of the road of shamanism is the dissolution of the boundary between life and death itself, then the million-year intuition that this was a path worth following will be dramatically vindicated. And one of the reasons I've preached DMT so furiously is I just want a larger body of people to take it so that we can compare data. We need to understand, how is this possible? It raises a whole host of questions. One is, not only how is this possible, but then given that is this possible, how has it been kept secret? How can millions of people go to the grave, raise children, hold jobs, so forth and so on, go to the grave, and the news of a doorway standing that agape hasn't penetrated? I mean, most people believe they're imprisoned in this world, and that the only hope is maybe 15 years at the ashram and hideous acts of self-abnegation and control and so forth and so on. And actually, the boundary between us and an unspeakably bizarre world, it's 30 seconds away at any time, as long as you have DMT available to smoke. That's appalling to me. I mean, it means we don't know nothing. Yeah.
You talk about trying to map your experiences onto the myths. I wonder if it's possible that you could look at the myths for information of mastery. That is, we've no longer masters of this doorway. We're trying to rediscover a mastery that's been held for thousands of years. Maybe there's something that we can find in the myths that tell us a behavior or a mode of being in that state that would be useful. For instance, catching the leprechaun and getting the pot of gold implies there's some kind of game we can play with them that yields some value.
Yeah, well, the classical myth about leprechauns is that they want to keep you. If they catch you, or if you mess with them, they'll hold you. And then you have to bargain your way out. And the bargain is always the solution of a riddle. Notice that what's happening here is it's all about linguistic prowess. It's all about poetic skill. It's all about language ability. Only the eloquent, only the clever, only those who are masters of riddlery and pun are acceptable to these entities. Apparently that's what they value. Why? I guess because they're made of language. So, and they themselves have, when I try to describe to people what they are or what they look like, various things can be said. They're like self-dribbling jeweled basketballs. In other words, they don't have faces or anything, not the little yellow leather jerkins and the curve-pointed shoes, not that. Dribbling self-dribbling jeweled basketballs, and they use the language to make objects. That's what this language, how this language is different from ordinary English. English, we can make meaning. The DMT language makes objects. It's like a higher dimensional language. And so these things bound forward with the complete purpose of delighting you. And they reach into the air, into their bodies, into some nearby invisible dimension, and they pull out what I would call words, puns, objects, hallucinations, things which manage to be all those things simultaneously. And they say, look at this. And it's purely designed to dazzle and astound. And then a colleague will elbow the little guy aside and say, no, look at this. And they're all in front of you, chirping, clamoring. And these objects that they make begin themselves to speak and float away and reproduce. And you've arrived. 30 seconds ago, you were sitting in a room with your grubby friend somewhere pursuing spiritual understanding. Now this is going on, and it's very hard to not be horrified. I mean, the cognitive dissonance, the neck-snapping switch of dimensions, and then after about 3, 4, 5 minutes, it retracts. It loses its vitality, and it begins to pull away from you, almost like a boat pulling away from a dock. And in fact, I had one trip where, metaphorically, not having hands, they all turned and waved and said, "Déjà vu, déjà vu," which is, of course, absurd. Now, people can say all kinds of things. They can say, well, this is just the autonomous substructures of the psyche manifesting themselves. But it sounds to me like a lawyer's explanation. Yeah.
In light of that, allow me to extend the skeptical line just a bit further. Of your description of the event, is it common to everyone who has participated, to your knowledge, does it represent 10%, 50%, 75%? Are they equal in description? Do they vary? Is this unique to your description?
All good questions. It's hard to smoke DMT, especially if you're not a smoker. It's harsh. Some people don't get enough. I would say of the people who smoke as much as I think you should smoke, 75% probably report something like this. It's hard for people to report. I mean, I've had years and years of practice. What I've just told you about this is an incredibly crumpled, compressed, edited version, because what is really happening in there is unspeakably bizarre. Unspeakably bizarre. That seems in fact to be its quality, that it is unspeakable, and that therefore in order to speak of it, you have to make a leap of faith to this higher order glossolalia-like language. Ayahuasca is a slow-release DMT if you deconstruct it pharmacologically, so that instead of it happening, DMT, instead of it happening in 4 minutes, it happens over 4 hours. Again, at very high dose ayahuasca and at very high dose psilocybin, these entities begin to emerge. When I take psilocybin, sometime in the second hour, I pass through a place which I've learned to recognize. It's a feeling, and I call it elf country. And there are no elves, but there's a feeling. And then I call them, and following the directions of a favorite episode of I Love Lucy, I call them by saying, come in, little green men, come in, little green men. It's simply a permitting. It's simply an invocation. And then they approach like a Newari band from a distance. You can hear the brass and the drum, and as they get closer, and it begins as a sound. It's very interesting. It begins as a sound, and as it gets louder, there comes a point where imperceptibly it becomes visible. And then all I can say is it gets bigger, just like someone marching toward you through three-dimensional space. And so it goes from being a little phenomenon on the horizon of your awareness to you're there, you're with them, you're playing the tuba, you're marching along, it's happening. And then they sort of peel off and march away and leave you in the same way they came. The archetype of this phenomenon, as far as I can tell, is the archetype of the circus. DMT is somehow the cosmic circus. And if you analyze what the circus is, it's a closed environment of permitted outrageousness that roves the straight landscape, setting up in one town and then another and then another. And it's a thing of wonder and light. And carny people are loose. They're not like you and me. I remember in the little town I grew up in, every 4th of July, the carnival would come to town for Cherry Day. And we kids were told we couldn't stay out after 9 o'clock when the carnival was in town, because there was just this aura, more liquor was being consumed, more people were staying up late, so forth and so on. And if you analyze the circus, it has all the elements of the DMT thing. I mean, there's the center ring, the clowns. And Henry Munn, in a wonderful essay on psilocybin mushrooms called The Mushrooms of Language, describes them as self-performing acrobatic bits of grammar, is how he describes them. This is clearly the same thing. The circus is a wonderful place for children, but it has behind that a dark side. I think my own earliest reminiscence of what I could call erotic awareness, I must have been very, very young, under 3, because I was being held by people. And I was taken to a circus, and there was a woman there in a tiny G-string costume, spinning, hanging by her teeth up near the center, and it was all there. Death and eros and risk and drama, and, you know, I got it.
Well, over time and using tricks, you can drag a certain amount of data out of it. And what I'll do is I'll describe a DMT trip, and it's a composite of maybe 40 of these trips, and then you can see what you make of it. So this is, I'll just describe it. I'll be the graduate student, you be the guy with the clipboard. You're saying to me, so what happened? Okay, here's what happened. I took one takes. Most people can get off in about 3 to 4 hits. Now there's a trick to it. Hash smokers are greatly favored in this endeavor because you really need leather lungs for this. The great problem is that people will cough or not be able to hold it in. You take 2 hits in a situation where your clothes have been loosened and you can just flop backward when you need to. You take 2 hits. Now many people miss the point because after 2 hits you feel completely peculiar. You feel as though your body is undergoing some strange kind of anesthesia. All the air has been pumped out of the room. This is the visual acuity thing I talked about last night. The colors jump up. The edges sharpen. And at that point, people say, whoa, wow, it's really coming on strong. And then what you have to do is you have to take one more enormous hit. And this separates the intrepid from the casual, believe me. Because most people, and the facilitator doesn't want to lean on the person. You say, damn it, take the third hit. And say, no, I feel completely weird. Say, I know you feel weird, but take the third hit. Well, if you can coax somebody into that, then what happens is you close your eyes and you see the ordinary warm brown back, closed eyelid scenario, and then these colors begin racing together, and it forms this mandalic, floral, slowly rotating thing, which I call the chrysanthemum. This is a place in the trip that you want to see as you go by it. The chrysanthemum forms, and you watch it for like 15 seconds. If it doesn't give way, then you didn't do enough. You have to do more. One more hit usually will do it. Well, then what happens is it like physically propels you through this chrysanthemum-like thing, and there's a sound like a saran wrap bread wrapper being crumpled up and thrown away, that crackle. A friend of mine says, this is your radio intellecty leaving through the anterior fontanelle at the top of your head. I don't know what it is, but it's something is being... Yeah, right, that's what it is. And then there's this very defined sense of bursting through something, a membrane. And on the other side, and this is now, remember, my experience, on the other side, as you break through, there's a cheer. There's a whole bunch of entities waiting on the other side. And they, that Pink Floyd song, the gnomes have learned a new way to say hooray. Well, it's that place. It's those gnomes. And you burst into this space, and they're saying, how wonderful that you're here. You come so rarely. We're so delighted to see you. And one of the things about DMT that's really puzzling is, in a sense, it doesn't affect your mind. In other words, you don't change. For instance, if you take ketamine, the first thing you notice, the very first thing you notice before the trip hits, is you notice that you no longer are anxious about having taken ketamine. You just sort of, anxiety leaves you. That means it's affecting your mind. It's doing something to the judgmental machinery. DMT doesn't lay a hand on the judgmental machinery. You break through into that space exactly who you were before breaking through. And the usual reaction of most people is something like, and you think, God, heartbeat, normal, pulse, normal, everything's normal, yeah, everything's normal, oh God. Because these things are there, and they're hammering at you, and they come forward. They're like jeweled, self-dribbling basketballs. And there are many of them, and they come pounding toward you, and they will stop in front of you and vibrate, but then they do a very disconcerting thing, which is they jump into your body. They jump into your body, and then they jump back out again. And the whole thing is going on in this very high-speed mode, where you're being presented with thousands of details per second, and you can't get a hold on, you say, my God, what's happening? And these things are saying, don't abandon yourself to amazement, which is exactly what you want to do. You just want to go nuts with how crazy this is. They say, don't do that. Don't do that. Pay attention. Pay attention to what we're doing. Well, what are they doing? Well, what they're doing is they're making objects with their voices. They're singing structures into existence. These things are, and what they will do is they'll come toward you, and then, and you have to understand, they don't have arms, so we're kind of downloading this into a lower dimension to even describe it. But what they do is they offer things to you. Say, look at this, look at this. And as your attention goes toward these objects, you realize that what you're being shown is impossible. It's impossible. It's not simply intricate, beautiful, and hard to manufacture. It's impossible to make these things. The nearest analogy would be to the Fabergé eggs or something like that. But these things are like the toys that are scattered around the nursery inside a UFO or something. Celestial toys. And they are, the toys themselves appear to be somehow alive. The toys themselves can sing other objects into existence. So what's happening is there's just this proliferation of elf gifts. And the elf gifts are moving around, singing, and the whole thing is directed toward, they're saying, do what we are doing. And they're very insistent. They say, do it, do it, do it. And you feel like a bubble. And now this is subjective. I mean, only 5% report this, but it happens to me. You feel like some kind of bubble inside your body that's beginning to move up toward your mouth. And when it comes out, it isn't sound, it's vision. You discover that you can pump stuff out of your mouth by singing, and they're urging you to do this. They say, that's it, keep doing it. And the whole thing is like, we're now at minute 4.5 with this stuff. And you speak in a kind of glossolalia. There's a spontaneous outpouring of syntax unaccompanied by what is normally called meaning. It's sort of, he ding wow wak saptivi mudektivi tinget wahaksiki pipinem wahavedektam bohagagetek. And this is accompanied by a modality, something seen. And they're saying, yes, do it, do it, do it. And then after a minute or so of this, the whole thing begins to collapse in on itself. And they literally begin to physically move away from you. And usually their final shot is they actually wave goodbye and they say, déjà vu, which makes no sense at all if you analyze it. So then you come down, and you're now at minute 6 to 7, and you come down, and it's like being more loaded than you've ever been. It's like about a 700 mic acid trip, but you embrace it as totally down. You say, I'm totally down. I mean, you look like a termite from Arcturus, and the room is decorated in Amish quilts, but I'm completely back. And then, over a minute or a minute and a half or so, the room just comes right back together, and 4 minutes after that, some people can give no account of it whatsoever. They just say, I don't know. It was the weirdest thing that ever happened to me, and I can't remember it now.